Okay. Hello, everyone. It is great to see you at another one of our events, the book launch for Truth Commissions and State Building. My name is Melike Yılmaz. I am the research coordinator of the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice at McMaster. And thank you for joining us in person and virtually today. For the virtual attendees, please feel free to write your questions or comments in the chat. We will do our best to follow the Zoom chat as well. Let me start our event with the land acknowledgement. We at McMaster University Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice would like to take this time to recognize that we are currently on the traditional territory shared between Haudenosaunee, Confederacy and the Anishinaabe nations, which was acknowledged in the dish with one spoon, one poom belt. That one poom uses the symbolism of a dish to represent the territory and one spoon to represent that the people are to share the resources of the land and only take what they need. For many thousands of years, the first people sought to walk gentle on this land, offering their assistance to the first European travelers and sharing their knowledge for survival in what was at times a harsh climate. We seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, one based in honor and deep respect. May we be guided by law and right action as we transform of our personal and institutional relationships with our indigenous friends and neighbors. Now for our opening remarks, I will be passing it over to Dr. Juanita de Boras, who is the director of the center. And let me introduce Dr. de Boras. Dr. Juanita de Boras is a professor in the Department of History at McMaster University and the director of the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. She is a co-editor of two book series. One is Histories of Slavery and Its Global Legacy, Cambridge University Press, and another one is Confronting Atrocity, Human Rights and Restorative Justice, McGill Queen's University Press. Her research concentrates on the history of health, gender, and reproductive rights in the Caribbean within the context of imperialism and post-slavery societies. She has written two books, numerous articles and book chapters, and has co-edited 3 essay collections. Her most recent publications are Reproducing the British Caribbean, Sex, Gender, and Population Politics After Slavery. And the essay collection is Public Health and the Imperial Project. Her current research project explores the intersection of health and the law in the context of child incarceration in state institutions in the early 20th century Caribbean. Yes, Juanita.
Thank you very much, Melike, and welcome everyone. I'm so pleased to be here, and I'm really happy to welcome everyone here, people who are here in person and everyone who's out there online. So thank you so much for joining us to celebrate the publication of the co-edited collection titled Truth Commissions in State Building, edited by Dr. Bonnie Bawa, Dr. Sylvia Bawa, and Dr. Jasper Ayala Zuno, and published by McGill Queen's University Press. The books, as you can see here, are lovely, and they're going to be available for sale later. So thank you everyone for joining us. So this collection emerged from a series of conferences organized by the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. The book represents the first comparative study of the role of truth commissions in state building. It examines truth commissions as mechanisms for civic inclusion, identity formation, institutional reform, and nation building and rebuilding in post-conflict and post-authoritarian societies. Chapters of this volume draw on data from the Truth Commission's report database of the Confronting Atrocity Project, which is housed at the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice here at MAC. And the book itself is the first publication of the new book series that's based in the Center Confronting Atrocity, Human Rights and Restorative Justice. And this book and the book series itself aligns with the mandate of the CHRRJ. The center takes a broad approach to human rights and restorative justice. It approaches human rights not simply as legalistic entitlements, but also as ethical claims founded on cross-cultural notions of human dignity and well-being. Its approach to restorative justice emphasizes responsibility, redress, peace building, and society repair. The center's work is founded on the belief that collective acknowledgement of past atrocities, redress of present abuses, reflection and repair through restorative justice processes can help build more equitable and inclusive societies, and that this can foster civic engagement and democratic participation. The Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice is dedicated to the multidisciplinary and transnational study of human rights and restorative justice processes around the world, and it aims to address historical atrocities and contemporary human rights violations, as well as explore the ways in which societies seek to rebuild and repair in the aftermath of conflict. The center brings together a network of expert scholars, policymakers, human rights and peace-building practitioners, community leaders, and other stakeholders to study the impacts and legacies of human rights violations alongside the restorative justice mechanisms established to address these violations. In today's event, you'll hear from many of the scholars who contributed to this collection, and their presentations, I think you'll agree, demonstrate the kind of rich and important research on human rights that the center aims to support and develop. So now I'm going to turn things back over to our moderator, Dr. Melanie Young.
Thank you, Dr. Deborah. As she has mentioned, today we are here for the book launch, edited by Dr. Bonnie Bauer. I think everybody knows who he is, but just let me give a brief introduction about him. Normally we don't need it, but just in case, I'll make the brief information. Dr. Bonnie Bauer is a professor of global human rights at McMaster University. He is an independent expert of the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development. He is the Vice Provost of International Affairs of McMaster University. With over 30 years of experience as a human rights educator, policymaker, and practitioner, he has taught in universities in Africa, Europe, the United States, and Canada. He coordinates the Confronting Atrocity Project, a transnational study of truth and reconciliation process. He is also the project director of Participedia, a global research network on public participation and democratic innovations. He has authored several books and journal articles on human rights, international development studies, and transitional justice. Yes, please.
Thank you, Maliki. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. I want to particularly thank the 54 people. The last time I checked, it was 54, maybe they're a bit more now. 54 people joining us online, particularly those who stayed up late in Hong Kong and Australia. Just to connect with us, I thank you for joining us. I know this is not that's not the best time for you, but we're glad you could join us. So welcome everyone, and welcome Dr. David Webster for generously agreeing to give a keynote presentation today. So this launch provides an opportunity to celebrate this publication, which has been many years in the making. The contributors will attest to that. And also to reflect critically on this book and its contributions to the field of transitional justice and truth and reconciliation studies. The field of Truth Commission studies is a relatively new one. The first Truth Commissions were established in Latin America in the 1980s, the first one being in Argentina, and South Africa established its own Truth Commission in 1993, and that has become kind of a paradigm for many of the Truth Commissions that have been established since then. So it is an emerging field, and we feel that this book contributes to what we call a third wave reflection of the ways Truth and Reconciliation Commissions work. So the first wave were right after the Truth Commissions in Latin America in the 1980s and 1990s. The second wave was after the Truth Commissions in the Middle East and Africa and Asia in the late 1990s. And now we see this book as a contribution to the third wave of studies that kind of draw on all these Truth Commissions, particularly as we now begin to see the Truth Commission model travel from the global south up on the global north, with Canada, Norway, Sweden, Spain, and now the EU pushing for truth and reconciliation models to address historical injustices. So as more countries in both the global south and the global north establish truth commissions to address human rights violations, we believe there is a need to better understand them as mechanisms for justice and peace building. This is the central motivation for this book. So although the field of Truth Commission studies is relatively new, there have been some critical studies that we acknowledge. But many of these studies have really approached Truth Commission and assessed Truth Commissions on the basis of their explicit mandates, which is threefold: truth-seeking, victim-centered justice, and in some cases, reconciliation. So those have been the key parameters for assessing Truth Commissions. And in many of these studies, there's an implicit assumption that state building is extraneous to the work of Truth Commissions. If anything, state building undermines the work of Truth Commissions. When sponsoring state authorities begin to deploy Truth Commissions for statist agendas, such as institutional reform, building social cohesion, enhancing civic inclusion, that it has a tendency to undermine the core goals of Truth Commissions, which is to find the absolute truth of what happened, to bring justice to victims, and to ensure accountability. And so in this book, we challenge that premise. We kind of frame Truth Commissions as state building projects. We challenge the assumption that state building is extraneous to the work of Truth Commissions. And we proceed from the premise that in many of the Truth Commissions that have been developed in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia, and relating to states recovering from protracted conflict, state building has actually been central to the work of Truth Commission. And not only state building central, that state building has to be one of the parameters we deploy in assessing the success or failure of Truth Commissions. So in some ways, this book aims at a contribution to an emerging field, but it is also a book that aspires to challenge some of the dominant orthodoxies in that emerging field. As I said before, we are at a critical moment in Truth Commission studies as Truth Commissions begin to travel from the global south, where they were first deployed in post-conflict and post-authoritarian contexts, and they're now being deployed in stable democracies. Just I think last month, Norway released its own National Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. Canada, of course, was one of the first stable democracies to adopt the Truth Commission model. And as we speak, I think almost all the Scandinavian countries have some kind of Truth Commission processes ongoing. There's also a bill in the US Congress, it's languished there for close to a decade now, to establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for slavery and the racial atrocities of that country. So we see this as a critical moment in what we've described in the book as the globalization of the Truth Commission model. Elsewhere, we've argued that the globalization of the Truth Commission model represents a paradigmatic shift in how we think about universal human rights, from a retributive justice model to a more restorative justice paradigm. I will leave it to David to make his critical reflection on the book. But I just wanted to say that from the very onset of this project, we did not want to produce a typically academic book. We recognize that the field of truth commission is one that brings together not just academics, but also practitioners, lawyers, who are doing the hard work of investigation, philosophers who theorize on truth commissions, practitioners. So what we sought to build from the very beginning was a book that brings together academics, policymakers, practitioners. And so what we have here is a book that brings together all of these academics, policymakers, practitioners working in truth commission studies. When I last checked, we had over 10 disciplines represented in this book in terms of the contributors. We have political scientists, historians, legal scholars, and legal practitioners, information science scholars, anthropologists, philosophers, development studies scholars, and even a former executive secretary of the National Truth Commission contributing a chapter to this book. So this is a book that really aims to look at the multifaceted nature of how truth commissions work. My co-editors and I have a lot of thanking to do, but I'll keep that at the end, to the end of the program. But I just wanted to acknowledge the contributors of this book, because they're the ones who did the heavy lifting. It started off as a conference in Accra, Ghana. What year was that? 2019. So this book has been quite a while in the making, and I want to thank them for believing in this project from the beginning and for their patience in just hanging with us to ensure that we produce the kind of volume that we originally envisaged. So briefly, my thanks to Jasper Yelazono at the University of Development Studies in Ghana, to Sylvia Bauer at York University, Canada, to Abena Asari at Sunnybrook University in the United States, to Seydou Alidou at the University of Ghana, to Albert Ame at Wilfrid Laurier University, to Abubakar Dakuyo at the University of Ottawa, to Jean Dules Kalibo at the International Humanitarian Law Center, to Teddy Fode Moser at the University of Sierra Leone, to Baba Jallo, a professor of history and former executive secretary of the Gambian National Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to Jameen L'Esperance at the University of Ottawa, also formerly with Lawyers Without Borders, to Gerard Miller at the University of Aberdeen, to Jean Nadihamana at the Aegis Trust Rwanda, who also works with the Rwandan Genocide Memorial, to Uche Chukwuwamba at the Toronto Metropolitan University, to Obiora Okafor at the Johns Hopkins University in the United States. Thanks for joining us, Obi. To Roger Southall at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, to Proskovia Svag at the University of Sorbonne University, Abu Dhabi, to Paul Ugo at the University of Waterloo, to Jennifer Wallace at McMaster University, and to Hakim Yusuf at the University of Derby in the United Kingdom. So thank you all contributors. I know many of you are online for joining us, and it's been an honor working with you on this project. I will now introduce, and I have the honor of introducing David Webster, who's worked in this field for a long time. David is a history professor at Bishop's University. He's the author of Flowers in the Wall, Truth and Reconciliation in East Timor, Timor-Leste, Indonesia, and Melanesia. This study, which I have used in my classes on truth and reconciliation, is a defining study of truth commission. Flowers on the Wall explores the experience of truth commissions in Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific. And one of the things that is unique about David's approach to truth commissions is that unlike many studies that focus on the establishment and the processes of truth commissions, his work examines the struggle to put the recommendations of truth commissions into practice. So anyone who's familiar with the challenges of implementing the 94 calls to action of the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission will know that establishing a truth commission is one thing, ensuring that its recommendations are implemented and have the effect, the desired effect, is quite another matter. And this is the area where David particularly contributes to this emerging field. David is a longtime human rights advocate. He serves on the International Advisory Council of Centro Nacional CHRRJ, which is the Truth Commission of Timor-Leste. David, we're glad to have you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Gosh. When you expect to hear a canned biography, it's always a surprise that somebody's added something to it, so thank you. Okay, so I guess I should start off by acknowledging the day and the beauty of the land and the waters. It is beautiful. It's good for your skin too, right? To have this kind of weather. And that as we heard in the land acknowledgement, the land has been cared for by the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee and by the Mississaugas. I am, of course, a visitor here from Ndakina, the land of the Abenaki, what's now Quebec. I also benefit from the fact this land has seen violent acts of colonial occupation that continue to this day, not far from this place. Want to learn more? There's an exhibit at the art gallery, which I'm going to look at carefully after this, on the Haldimand Tract and the Haudenosaunee history. So worth a look. I saw it for 5 minutes earlier today. Need more. So anyway, thanks very much to the team behind this book and this event. It's an honor to be present to talk about this book and the themes that it's contributing to in this third wave, I guess we'll call it. I'll go with that. Okay, so truth. It's a slippery concept, yeah? Seems like it would be simple working out an accurate record of events, but the truth is, truth can be elusive. There are many stories that compete to be called the truth. And that competition is about more than who's right. It's about how to address justice, how to build reconciliation, the very shape of nations and states, how they should look. It's about legitimacy. So truth commissions can act as referees, sure, legitimizers, storytellers, and yes, state builders. Arbiters of truth are also arbiters of the future. So one truth I am sure about is, come on in, sit down, there's room. One truth I am sure about is this is a terrific book. Really, I really enjoyed reading this. It's great stuff. It's ironic that there's more truth commissions in Africa than in the other continent, but the literature is dominated by the study of other areas. Just one exception, the Foundational Truth Commission in South Africa that reported in the 1990s. Yet the earliest truth commissions are not just in Bolivia, but also in Uganda, even if they were not successful back in the 1980s. The concept of peace building that can be traced back to Johan Galton's work in the 1970s really emerges along with the Somalia conflict, along with the work of Egyptian UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali, talking about an agenda for peace in the 1990s, and it gained momentum after the genocide in Rwanda. Is this just the world responding to events in Africa? Is the African Union and its human rights system just some pale echo of the European Union? Well, as Dr. Bonney and others have demonstrated, I think pretty conclusively, no, absolutely not. Very much not. So I want to recognize, first of all, the contribution this book makes in putting Africa at the center. And also, and I think really in particular, for refusing to limit its lessons by adding the words "in Africa" to the title. This is not just about Africa. Its arguments about the importance of truth commissions in state building apply much more broadly. Truth commissions build countries after authoritarian regimes and after and even during war and other forms of conflict. So why do studies of truth commissions when they look at Africa, dwell only on one country, on South Africa? Why do studies of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, locate it rightly in Indigenous history, but make so few links to the TRC experience elsewhere in the world? After all, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada opened with a session featuring Truth Commission participants from 10 other countries. The TRC spokesperson, Senator Murray Sinclair, recognized the connection between truth and reconciliation in Canada and truth and reconciliation globally. I guess to bring it into relying with current events, why have so few journalists and analysts remarked on the way that Gambia and South Africa are remaking international law with their genocide cases right now at the International Court of Justice against Myanmar and Israel, respectively? We're going to hear about one of those tomorrow, apparently. So I think part of the explanation, well, it's the structure of the Western Academy, not to criticize your hosts, but the way that it's all set up. Researchers' preferences for studying places that are easier to get to, places that somehow feel more familiar. So again, it's wonderful to see this book actually centering African voices as authors of the story. By that, I mean the researchers and experiences of people in truth processes in the very diverse countries of Gambia, Ghana, Burkina Faso, Mali, Nigeria, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, South Africa, and on a continent-wide basis. It makes some really important interventions, such as Teddy Fossé-Moussa's call for the popular UN concept of peace infrastructure, the transfer of ownership for peace building from international to national authorities, to lead also to such mechanisms as a People's Truth Commission that honors local choices in Sierra Leone. So when I edited Flowers on the Wall, I was hoping it might add some Southeast Asian and Pacific Island experiences to the broader literature. Can't say that's really happened. But I can say that Truth Commissions and State Building is a much more thorough and complete book, and therefore I hope it's going to make a bigger impact on the field. Okay, the main argument we made in Flowers on the Wall is that truth and reconciliation has to be understood as a process, not as an event, not as a project, not as time limited to when the commission is set up and when it lands on the desk of policymakers. A process with phases. There's a pre-truth commission phase in which civil society mobilizes and demands truth and accountability. As West Papuan activists said, and West Papua being a territory of Indonesia, in order to build what they called a land of peace, or tanah damai, there had to be truth seeking. They called for pelurusan sejarah, meaning to make straight the history, to straighten out the historical record of the West Papua conflict. And this led to the passage of a law that promised a truth commission that would seek real truth, not the official non-truth that's taught in government schools and publications. Yet governments have not been willing to authorize truth-seeking and truth-telling processes in that context. The lack of truth-seeking, the lack of a historical dialogue, continues to fuel conflict in Indonesian-ruled West Papua. So this is a negative example. A territory seeking independence denied its claim to a state and therefore denied a truth-seeking process because that might change how the history is understood. And the history is so central to the conflict here. So this is the pre-Truth Commission phase, and obviously you have a Truth Commission. Afterwards, there's a post-TRC phase. So thanks for noticing. So in Timor-Leste, which I know the best probably, the truth process is more than a commission, more than a report, more than a quest for reconciliation even. It is in the title of a film produced by the post-commission follow-up body for Timor-Leste's Truth Commission, Adalan Badamai, A Road to Peace, Towards Peace, I guess. So I want to acknowledge that organization. Possibly the director is online. I don't know what time zones are doing, but if he is, I acknowledge the presence of Hugo Fernandez, who's director of the Centro Nacional CHRRJ, the follow-up body to Timor-Leste's very impressive Truth Commission, and a truly impressive institution in its own right, carrying on the work of setting straight history, promoting reconciliation, and promoting a nation grounded in a conflict, promoting a nation grounded in a culture of peace and human rights, which you might call state building, right? So, Centro Nacional CHRRJ, it's not in power. Its staff did not all vote for the current government. Some of them may have campaigned for other parties, but that's a strength here. The center is nonpartisan. Its leadership named by government and civil society and religious groups, but not beholden to them. So this is, I think, important in follow-up bodies that's not too closely linked to the government in power. what I've been thinking about as I read through truth commissions and state building is really how well the argument holds up in non-African cases. So I'm certainly not an authority on any African countries, so, but it holds up, right? Truth commissions, if I pull up the book's introduction, are about a lot more than truth telling and a lot more than reconciliation, right? State building, the introduction says, is integral to transitional justice. And that's true even when it's not written down in a mandate. As the introduction again says, truth commissions are inherently state building projects, even when this is not apparent from their mandates. So what's not written down can still be true, can still be inherent, especially if we read against the grain and see what's not actually printed. So the argument's about Africa, but I think it works well in Asia as well. I won't speak for other parts of the world, but it probably yes. Okay, Timor-Leste's Truth Commission and the Post-Commission follow-up body have both helped to consolidate common understandings of the past and a common vision of a democratic, rights-respecting Timor-Leste. I'm going to use Timor-Leste rather than East Timor because that's what we've been asked to use for the country's name, right? Just means East Timor though. The Truth Commission's public hearings in that country witnessed reconciliation between leaders who had once been in conflict. They embraced, they competed for whose fault was the greatest, in fact, overcompensating possibly. The Truth Commission's public hearings witnessed them reconciling. Village-based ceremonies rolled out what they called the Big Mat to bring survivors and perpetrators together for truth-telling processes that has made living together at least possible, at least imaginable. And this has helped to build a stable democratic state in the aftermath of mass atrocity. We're now 2 decades in independent Timor-Leste. It even held the world's only joint truth commission sponsored by 2 governments, with the participation of the government of Indonesia, the former occupying power of Timor-Leste for 24 years. Through this commission, Indonesia's government accepted the Timorese narrative of past oppression, confirmed the truth of the Timor-Leste Commission, and this has aided the consolidation of the Timor-Leste state, I think. Recognition of the truth by the former colonizer helped consolidate the new state. So that mattered, especially after a 24-year occupation when Indonesian authorities enforced a very different narrative of the past, one that denied the very existence of a Timorese people. Well, so the Joint Truth Commission is a powerful antidote in validating a certain retelling of the past. It makes a strong contrast to West Papua, where the absence, as I said, of a truth process has consolidated conflict instead. We might equally compare South Korea, which has had a number of truth processes in the aftermath of military dictatorship, and which has consolidated a pretty strong democracy by this point, to Myanmar or Burma, which in the absence of truth-seeking sees ever worsening conflict and history wars. And by history wars, I don't mean arguing about how to write textbooks like we do in Canada. I mean actual literal wars about clashing historical narratives. The history contributes to the conflict, fuels the conflict. So we need truth-telling if we're going to move towards conflict resolution. At least we need dialogue between different historical narratives, which is what Timor-Leste has done. So the thwack of a report landing on a politician's desk like this. Here it is, 5 volumes. I wanted to bring a 5-volume report, but I just can't play that much on the train. So this sound of the report landing on a politician's desk, or the silencing of the report in some cases, it's not the end of the story. It's not even the beginning of the end. It opens a new stage in a process of truth-telling and nation-building. So I say nation-building here because, as the book's chapters also point out, we're not simply talking when we say state-building about the construction of a strong state, or what Sylvia Bawa calls in her chapter, independent colonial states that replicate some of the flaws of colonialism. I'm not talking about making that stronger. I think when you talk about state building here, you're talking about something else. If we were, we'd be trying the impossible challenge, as Abubakar Dakuto notes in his chapter, of trying to build effective democracy on a foundation of lies about the past. So maybe we're talking about some sort of democracy building. Here I'm going to quote Baba Jallo's chapter, a politically empowered citizenry is the best guarantee against oppression and political impunity. So this is not a top-down state building project. So I suppose here I'm talking about, and many of the chapters are talking about, the construction and honoring of a strong civil society too, which is also central to restoring or to building and sustaining rights-respecting countries. What Dr. Bonney and Jennifer Wallace call civic participatory processes need to be seen much more clearly in pre-Truth Commission and especially post-Truth Commission phases. To me, the real work of Truth Commissions comes in this post-TRC phase. So South Africa has a follow-up body to its TRC, but it's not one that's really made a global impact. The South African TRC, it's founded out of necessity with the promise of partial impunity to get reconciliation, right? The South African author Gillian Slovo writes that stories shared at the South African TRC were, quote, shot through with accounts of what had happened to individuals and with lamentations of pain and suffering. People had come to mourn, to be heard, to put their truths on record. There lies the paradox. The wonder of the TRC and the thing for which it is best known resides not in its original purpose to provide amnesties, but its byproduct, the victims' hearings. So she's talking about South Africa. It's not that far from the stories told, for instance, in the Regional Truth Commission for Jeju Island, South Korea, where people have been clamoring to share their stories and be recognized for the pain of their past for a long time before the Truth Commission was finally created, and who see the Truth Commission as a way of validating, breathing life into, and sustaining those stories about their suffering. So, are there other models, other lessons? Well, okay. Okafor and Ngwaba in their chapter, they argue there's an emerging African model of truth commissions, seen not just transitional justice, but transformative justice. So I like that word play on words there, right? Perhaps the problem of weak institutions that they identify can be addressed partly by regional civil society networks. And if so, Truth Commission participants form a potential border crossing constituency. Rather than the International Center for Transitional Justice that everybody cites, based in New York, or even the wonderful Lawyers Without Borders. I'm just going to point to a regional transitional justice network that I'm aware of called Asia Justice and Rights, or AJAR, which works in a number of South and Southeast Asian countries quite effectively. Mutual learning and support within the region has been vital to rights building efforts there. So I think that's important. All right. What else can I say about this terrific book? Outsiders, I think, as an outsider myself, I often see outsiders painting Africa as a land, an undifferentiated land of big men and weak rights for women, right? But others in this collection are actually speaking to women. I'm sitting next to one, right? Sylvia Bawa offers a fascinating discussion that goes some way to rehabilitating, for instance, the much vilified Winnie Mandela, showing her as more than the keeper of her husband's slippers while he's off in work or in jail, as the case may be. But sidelining women really has led to bad analysis too. Has maybe gone some way to removing the lens of blame from apartheid as a system, again, to draw on this chapter, which very persuasive argument about this. And I'm thinking here again about Gillian Slovo centering her victims with stories shot through with lamentations of pain and suffering. If the problem in South Africa was truth process's tendency to stress the individual at the cost of the system, do collective stories allow the system to reemerge? The importance of apartheid as a system? Are approaches over the longue durée, such as that taken by the Truth and Justice Commission of Mauritius, part of the answer? I mean, the Commission of Mauritius looked at the legacy of slavery and indentured servitude over a period of not just decades, but even centuries, when exploring historical injustice, not simply the last regime. So we took a different path there. Its example, I think, has been probably followed too rarely. Canada might have come the closest to examining historical injustice over a longer period, rather than a single regime. Guatemala's Truth Commission may have centered history and systems the most in ways that are also perhaps worth revisiting so long after Guatemala's 1980s Truth Commission. In any case, this gender lens is really needed, really important. So as Jean de Dieu Sikulubu points out, it's the right thing to do, but it also makes truth commissions more effective. So I think of the little known TRC held in Solomon Islands, which deserves more attention despite the burial of its final report. We have that report thanks to the fact it was leaked by an Anglican bishop who now lives in Hamilton, by the way. Okay, so Betty Begisi, one of its staffers, has identified a disconnect between the matrilineal land inheritance system of most of Solomon Islands and the male-centered, almost celebrity nature of the initial Truth Commission design in that country. launched with great fanfare, by the way, by Bishop Desmond Tutu, because who else could possibly launch a Truth Commission? Kagisi was in fact trying to Solomonize the Solomon Islands Truth Commission, to pull it away from the powerful narrative of South Africa as global template. You can make similar cases drawing, I think, from many of the chapters in this book. Community-based justice, again, according to Okafor and Ngwaba, is more suited to African context. The Gambian case seems to show the value in a democratic, local, and diverse selection process for truth commissioners. Initially unpopular, Baba Jallow writes, Gambia's commission, quote, captured the imagination of the population and launched a national conversation. And thus maybe George Millar's call for ethnographic peace research rather than one-size-meets-all approaches, drawing from his research in Sierra Leone is relevant. If I come back to Timor-Leste here in passing, its Truth Commission cites many community-based reconciliation sessions as one of the more successful aspects of the truth process there. People value those community hearings. People remember them. People still talk about them, and we're 20 years on now. So, what else can I say here? Stories. So unsurprisingly, there's a focus on stories here, noted by a number of authors, Paul Ugor being one of them. So Wallace and Ibawo recognize this is not uniquely African. They mentioned Solomon Islands and Timor-Leste, which is my excuse to keep talking about Solomon Islands and Timor-Leste today, even though they're not otherwise in the book. So I think this is important, and it links back to contesting ideas of truth. Our government has lied to us, Papuans say, when they call for straightening out the history. Another narrative is needed, a truer narrative. So, okay. At the same time, truth commissions to disrupt old narratives and craft new ones. They're writing a new nation into being. That's what South Africa was supposed to be doing, writing a new nation into building. Yeah, this is also state building. It's building in the realm of the imagination. The danger is perhaps that powerful outsiders and would-be dictators can shape new stories that entrench new powerful elites. Okay, I've written about how the Timor-Leste Truth Commission tried to write a new nation into being, based on a very Catholic narrative of disunity as original sin and increasing unity, leading to a nation worthy of freedom through its suffering and its ability to redeem itself. I was sort of thinking back to that again when I was reading the Rwanda chapter in this book, which shows the constructive use of memorialization and curriculum change to promote the regime's goal of social harmony. Well, this is state building. It's also state building that entrenches a new government in power, even as it reduces, quite importantly, internal divisions. Again, I'm going to connect here. In Timor-Leste, the current prime minister used the National History Museum as a backdrop to his campaign. He said, this museum is my story. I built the nation. And look, my museum tells you how. It's not his museum, it's the country's museum. But he's seeking votes on the basis of his contribution to national liberation. There's a danger there, perhaps. Okay, the other danger that academics need to be alive to, I think, is that outside researchers can also shape stories. They use their data as a pillow, as one Papuan elder told the research. I love this data. I'm so comfortable. It's helping me boost my career too. Okay. So researchers here are being maybe too extractive when they're digging through individual narratives to craft a new collective narrative. What have you done with our stories? One Solomon Islander asked the Australian researcher Louise Vela, what have you done with them? We're more than data, they imply. We shared our stories as a gift, but also in the hopes of change and action. In Solomon Islands, we can criticize the government for not printing, not publishing, not even debating its Truth Commission's report. But we should also maybe criticize researchers who are simply looking for stories as data to build their own new narratives and their own career possibly. So, Truth Commissions and state building, I don't think it falls into that extractive trap, thankfully. Okay. So what about the future, about states being built? Coming towards the end here. Truth Commissions and state building, I think, offers a terrific contribution in its section on archives. So Abina Ampafo-Asare points out that for all their enormous weight, again, 5 volumes, more than I could carry, Truth Commission reports are not a full archive, and thus not the full story. The preservation, processing, and publication of archival records of the raw material of the primary sources helps to build democratic space. They need to be accessible, not, in effect, disappeared archives. Janine L'Esperance notes that one problem in Mali was the commission report was not published. There's less stark examples, of course, where some information is selectively withheld, whether to serve the interests of powerful men, of researchers, or even of Truth Commission participants. And this secrecy makes sliding back away from democracy more likely, hampering state building. So the election of atrocity denier Javier Milei as president of Argentina is one recent example of the dangers here, perhaps. South Africa is a bad example here, Praskovia Sverd argues. So I would agree here with the American activist and archivist, Trudy Huskamp-Peterson, whose guide to preserving Truth Commission records argues that preservation, quote, completes the commission's work. Saving the records makes sure that amnesia does not prevail, or at least makes it less likely. Saving them, and I would add, making them accessible on a relatively open basis, while being careful to protect the privacy of victims and survivors, is vital to truth-seeking over the longer period, and thus to the consolidation of the gains made possible partly by truth commissions. More open archives could even combat the resistance by former collective perpetrator groups such as white South Africans, the subject of Roger Southall's chapter here, to full admission of truth about past collective complicity. Hey, perhaps white Canadians too. I shouldn't exempt myself, I suppose, right? Okay, since many truth commissions in Africa are too recent to have follow-up bodies, I'm just going to circle back to a couple of examples from Asia that may be relevant here. So Centro Nacional Chega is a follow-up body. It's got a powerful mandate to promote historical understanding and human rights thought and practice, and a mandate to seek the implementation of the Timor-Leste's Truth Commission's recommendations. Its mandate's also international. It's advised on truth processes in other countries. One example is Aceh province of Indonesia, where a provincial government authorized a truth commission. Imagine Ontario setting up its own truth commission. It's been done in the Australian state of Victoria. Aceh province, the provincial government established a truth commission that they decided would never close its doors. So it issued a report in December 2023, very up to date. But its work continues. The commission is its own follow-up body. It's an interesting model. So start to wrap up here with a word on reparative justice. So Joanna Quinn and many others have divided transitional justice models into retributive, restorative, and reparative types. This book, like many, includes truth commissions as a form of restorative justice. Desmond Tutu weeping, survivors of Canadian residential schools embracing. These are iconic images of the restorative justice tradition. And yet, I don't know, look at the statistics shared by Robert Ame and Seide Alidu in their chapter on Ghana. What people sought was reparations, monetary compensation for suffering, material compensation, to set the record straight, truth in other words. Reparations are literally about repair, not restoring anything, certainly not restoring a situation in place before that was itself unjust. Instead, the goal is to fix what was unjust. So Hakeem Youssef makes a related argument in his chapter about the need to transform the judiciary from agent of government repression into something more fair and accountable. So reparations, they can be financial, but they may be at root about recognition. Hear my story, really listen to it, take it in, repair the injustice, straighten out the history in the Papuan demand. Reparations, Dakuyo writes, give a sense of justice that can indirectly have a strong impact on democracy by building trust between state and victims. Gambia's successes, it seems from reading the chapter here, were helped by the Commission's mandate allowing it to grant reparations directly to survivors. Timor-Leste's follow-up body, while carrying out a range of symbolic reparations, memorialization, for instance, is moving increasingly to center material reparations to survivors of mass violence and their families. So I'm wondering as I read, and this is just a question, not an argument, whether the most successful truth commissions are those that take a relatively high focus on reparative justice, even of collective reparations to identified groups, distressed in Canada and Mauritius, for example. And yeah, ending here as the book does, this means a right to truth. Truth about the recent past, and also I think truth about the deeper past, going back further. So I'm going to end there with thanks for your patience and listening to me go on for so long. And again, with gratitude for the chance to be here today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for those very critical reflections and insights.
Those are praiseworthy. That's praise.
Yeah, but it also allowed us to think about the book in a new way, in ways that even those of us who were involved in the project might not have. I particularly like the comparative analysis, and I'm hoping we can do more of that, build connections between experiences, transcontinental and transnational. Thank you. I appreciate it. So we'll now shift gears a bit to the next phase. We wanted to give voice to those who contributed to this volume. I think we had 15 contributors, so there won't be enough time to have everyone speak, but we've assembled a panel of 3 or 4 contributors to just speak to their chapters. We've developed some prompt questions to guide them. The first one is for them to reflect on what they consider the key contributions of their chapter to the overarching theme of the book, which is truth commissions and peace and state building. And then also reflect a bit on the critical gaps that they have identified in terms of where the scholarship on transitional justice and truth commission is going. What should scholars be studying more? So we have on the panel, Abena Asari. I think she's joining us online. Is Abena with us? Yes, she is. Okay, thank you. Jasper Ayalazuno from Ghana. Abena is joining us from somewhere in New York. I don't know. She'll let us know. We have Jasper Ayalazuno, who's joining us from Tema in Ghana. It's Tamale. Tamale. Okay, thanks for the correction. We have Roger Southall, who's joining us from South Africa, I think Johannesburg. Is Roger online? Yes, Roger is online. Thank you, Roger. And we have Sylvia Bauer, who's joining us in person. So we'll go in the order in which we've listed the contributors. And I'll urge you to keep your interventions to 7 minutes max, so that we have enough time for some kind of audience interaction and questions. So 7 minutes. The prompts again are: what do you consider the key contributions of your chapter to the overarching themes of the book? And what are the critical gaps in transitional justice and truth commission studies that you think scholars should focus more on? So Abena, please, you can take the floor. Thank you.
So, thank you, everybody. I hope I can be heard. It is an honor to be here and to celebrate this wonderful book. So, a piece of the hope of the TRC idea, right, is that these instruments can be a salve for the states that have been torn by historical injustice and violence. TRCs are instruments that help us to imagine a day after, yes, after the violence is over. What do we need to bring about an order that can evade these cycles of destruction and allow human flourishing? So as lots of the sections of this excellent book show, on the ground, the gap between the rhetoric and the reality of these instruments can be daunting. So my chapter speaks to the imperative of archives, right? The importance of preserving, processing, and trying to make accessible these records, which are gathered by TRCs. I suggest that these archives are among the most potent aspects of the TRC experiments and must be rigorously treasured and read every time a TRC comes into being. The existence of an archive is key to the transformation that TRCs pursue, because it is the archive that ensures that the TRC's hopes can exist beyond a time of its creation. The other way of saying this is that the archives help to project the wisdom, the yearning of the TRC exercise into a future that may be more ready to embrace all of its gifts. Our reality is that many of the countries and the states that stage these TRCs are yet unable to create the structures that are aligned with the visions of the future that victims and witnesses testify to, right? So even as this gap is there, I look to time as it does pass and the existence of archives as a way to approach the innovation of the TRC in expansive ways. So in my section, I talk about the exercise in Ghana, and I describe its unruly archives. These are archives in which everyday folk speak both about how they have been harmed and about what it might take to actually make them whole. And often that they speak in their own tongues, in their own ways, and with their own goals. They go to the TRC because they have some type of an incentive. It could be economic, it could be social, it could be cosmic, right? They add their voice to this public record for a purpose. And the impact of this is a record of the national past in Ghana, which is unlike any other, right? This is an archive which is uneven, it has gaps, it has goals, and it is often overlooked beyond the pathos, right? Beyond the raw suffering, who was harmed and how. So I wrote this chapter about the importance of archives because of a reality which I saw and I observed, both in Ghana, but also in other countries as I looked at the afterlives of TRCs throughout Africa and also elsewhere in the world. And this reality was that a few years after a TRC has been created and has occurred with much fanfare, when you look for these archives, they can be difficult to find. Oftentimes, this can be because the government, the state that has sponsored this TRC, has kept the archives back or has held them for a long time. It can also be the case that, pieces of the archives are public, but the witness statements, right? The thousands of records, the videos, all of that is hard to access. It can be an issue of tech, right? That there have been cases in which there are instruments which have these very rich websites, which have the testimonies, which have maps, which have clips, which have news spots. But then a few years afterwards, that once thriving website has gone dark and can't be found, right? So this question about the archives and the lack of access, it can occur in part, it can occur completely, it can occur with a bang, right? a catastrophe of like a fire, a flood, this has occurred, or it can occur with a whisper. How difficult it is for students to access these records at times with the levels of state bureaucracy and red tape. So there has been a neglect, a lack of attention to how potent these archives are, especially over time. And thus there's been a lack of attention to how to make sure that these archives are preserved, especially within the home country. But this does not have to be the case. If we understand that the goals that these instruments pursue is oftentimes a work of decades and years, right? We must understand the TRC exercise as a seed. And we must try to prioritize the creation of strong TRC archives every time a commission is established. There must be resources and thought and structure put into being able to allow these unruly archives to live on as time capsules, as notes, as letters to a future that may need them, that may use them, that might read them differently, more fully than we are able to in our own time. So I think I will stop there. That was among the main things that I discussed in my chapter, and I still see that tension as we move into the next stage of this TRC instrument, right? How do we understand these as gifts that can be useful even beyond our time? And archives are a key piece of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abena, for those remarks. I'll now move over to Jasper Yelazulo. And just a reminder to keep your intervention under 7 minutes so we have enough time for questions and answers. Jasper?
Okay, thank you. And it's evening in Ghana, especially particularly in Tamale, where I am based, and thanks to David for that rave review of the book. My comments are in connection with the framing of the in the book of truth commissions as state building, vehicles for state building. And I want to situate this in the context of the emerging autocratization of states or governments in West Africa. As most of you might have heard, in West Africa, we are experiencing maybe the olden days of coup d'etats, and what scholars are beginning to talk about as the retreat or the backsliding of democracy. Bearing in mind that truth commissions are supposed to be vehicles for building not just states, but democratic states. So what lessons does this book provide in the context of the present backsliding and of democracy, not just in Africa, but across the world, taking into consideration the fact of right-wing populist governments and maybe even left-wing populist government in the Western world and North America. So in that sense, this book, I will argue, and as we argue in the introductory chapter, should not just be about how truth commissions can serve as instruments for democratic state building, but taking into consideration the fact that there are also memories, archival memories, and how they remind us of the past histories of the breakdown of states as a result of autocracy, dictatorship, or conflict. This book will serve as not just truth commissions being a way of rebuilding states, but we can then even push it further to say that this book provides lessons on how not to break states down or how not to break democratic states down. Because there is a lot of lessons documented in the book that probably can serve as a guide to citizens, a guide to leaders as to how not to break down democratic states. And I want to specifically talk about Ghana and the Ghana Truth Commission, in which I was involved directly as a staff of the Ghana National Reconciliation Commission. And then what happens in Ghana at the moment, post the National Reconciliation Commission, taking into consideration the fact that Ghana is supposed to be a model of a successful democracy in Africa. Then this Truth Commission, the lessons provided were to bring about unity, to be reminded of the past violence and not just dictatorship by some civilian governments. And I remember my work in the Truth Commissions those days, where we go around educating the youth, secondary school kids, government workers. We visit them and we talk about the purpose of the NRC, namely that it's supposed to serve as a reminder of the past violence and the dictatorship in particular. But as Sabina and then the other chapter by Amy and Aliru point out, and especially Abina Asari's book, Truth Without Reconciliation, point out, it looks like we are experiencing the same contradictions of truth commissions, because the very lessons that the NRC was supposed to teach and to remind Ghanaians and Ghanaian leaders, and in this case about the past and how to prevent it, seem to be not adhered to, because in Ghana we are experiencing the last 10 years what might be called an emerging autocratization of the state. I mean, the last 8 years with the disappearance of journalists and even the killing of journalists, the emerging culture of silence, journalists being arrested, and especially election violence, where in the last 2020 election, more than 8 people died. And that is why in Abina's book, he points out whether political elites, when they establish this truth commission, whether they are interested in the outcome or the results. So there's a sense in which I'm trying here to push the boundaries that this book has already pushed in terms of truth commissions serving as state building. I want us to push those boundaries further, and then to probably point out or to look at how truth commissions can actually be lessons on how not to break down democratic states. And for that matter, there's a sense in which this book contains lessons for that. And I'm also pointing out that it's not just about writing or after finishing or completing the book, we are happy a book is published. How can we go beyond that? And acting as public intellectuals, I promote this book as a guide as to how not to break democratic states down. I think I'll stop at that and then let other panelists take over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasper, for those insightful comments. I'll now hand it over to Roger Southall, who's joining us from the University of Wits, joining us from Wits, I believe, Roger, in South Africa. It must also be late where you are now. Can you pin Roger?
Yes, I'm here. Right, well, I have to admit that I came to this as an imposter because I knew very little about TRCs. My interest was provoked because I was writing, we're getting on for 2 to 3 decades after the arrival of democracy. And my particular interest was how the white minority, the only significant white minority, Namibia apart, which is of course a very small population, but the South African white population is the only significant white resident population left in Africa. So I was interested in exploring how whites have accommodated to democracy. So inevitably, this involved me looking at the TRC. And my 2 questions was how did whites react to the TRC at the time? And how do they look back at the present time? So my principal interest in the TRC from where I was coming from was not so much in the narrative, which seems to be the, of course, one of the major concerns of so many TRC scholars in this book and elsewhere. Just on a lot of the literature has quite correctly pointed to many of the limitations of the South African TRC and the problems it faced. And looking at particular is the limited participation of whites for understandable reasons. We have to remember that the National Party did not want, they wanted a general amnesty. They didn't want all this stuff of having to confess and all that sort of business. But in the end, the ANC negotiated very cleverly, I think, and got the amnesty for truth provision, which rather, I think, took the National Party by surprise for various reasons, because they had been involved closely in the amnesty provisions. You had 1 or 2 ministers appearing to the TRC, but very little other government participation. Former President P.W. Botha simply refused to appear before the TRC, and in the end, the government gave up. Desmond Tutu gave up, said, no, it's not worth the hassle. Former President de Klerk appeared before the TRC and was full of denial. I didn't know, we didn't know about it. It's the other guys were doing it. And so who you had coming forward, essentially, where the, if you like, truth-telling came from the perpetrators, was from those down the chain, mostly from the police, who had been involved in most of the human rights abuses, and you get some of the most notorious cases, de Kock and so forth. And then, of course, much dissatisfaction has been around the lack of prosecutions. And I think that really comes from the facts. One of the things which I think is coming out in the discussion is the distinction between what you might call forensic truth and alternative truths. The notion that forensic truth being the truth you need in a court of law to pin somebody down to prove they're guilty. And that is not sort of stuff you're getting out of the truth, which is often coming forward in truth commissions, which is not to say those truths are not valid, but they are different forms of truth. So that's one of the areas of complexity. So that is one of the difficulties of prosecutions. But one of the other difficulties of prosecution in South Africa has, of course, been, apart from limitations of skills and money, it's also been the ANC, many elements within the ANC themselves have been quite keen for no amnesties be given to the National Party, but very reluctant to see the whole performance of amnesty for truth being applied also to the ANC. And so there was, I think, there have been many accusations that accordingly there was a backroom deal between the National Party leadership and the ANC that there would be limited prosecution. That's another area, but I won't go for that now. But I think one of the things that really did, and I think this takes us to the whole state building exercise in South Africa, is that there was enough truth revealed by enough of the perpetrators of human rights offences to actually have an impact on the white population, that there was enough revealed to show that what a pretty tacky process it was, how bad the state had been. And I think that was key in what my former colleague and friend John Daniel, who worked as a researcher for the Truth Commission, wrote a really excellent chapter that one of the major functions of the TRC was actually to demobilize the right wing in South Africa by demobilizing the whole apartheid project. And I think this opened the door to potential reconciliation of whites. And if I may read one or two sentences from my conclusion. And this is looking back, goes to my later story about how whites look back to it now. Whites now accept the premises of democracy, if only because they see no other realistic alternative, and they accept the moral wrongfulness of apartheid and accept that apartheid was a crime against humanity. What they continue to wrestle with is the issue of complicity and acceptance of guilt, indicating a pronounced tendency to shuffle the blame for atrocities onto the political leadership and security forces. And this indicates the continuing challenge of reconciling the nation. And in regard to this, I think looking back from the other side of the, if you like, the racial divide, is that I think in the chapter by Paul Ugor in this excellent collection, is that he is showing in his chapter very much that young Black South Africans today are really, I think, look back on the Truth Commission as something of a sellout. Many of them see the democratic settlement today as a betrayal of the interests of the populations, and as the amnesty provisions, the amnesty for truth provision, as having given a let out for most of the former regime. And funnily enough, in the newspaper I take this morning, there were this statement in one of the columns I was reading. We know from South Africa's process of truth and reconciliation that these processes are more often about getting on with the business of business, shielding villains or sacrificing some actors, than they are about a lengthened, durable justice that can result in a better life today and tomorrow. There are very many people in South Africa who still will not accept the outcomes of the truth, of the country's truth and reconciliation process. So this shows that, I think your speaker before showed, that the TRCs are an ongoing process. There is no end to them. And I think there is continuing debate about the ambiguity of the TRC in South Africa. But on the positive side, I go back to one of the, I think, things that's said by another very serious student of the TRC, Andre Du Toit, is without the TRC, how much reconciliation would have happened in South Africa? And I think that South Africa is very much a different country today. We were asked to look, where are the gaps? And I think from my interest, I would say, looking at the long-term impact of TRCs, I think much of the interest in TRCs has been on how they operate, how they have operated as an immediate process, which is, of course, absolutely necessary. But TRCs are increasingly history for many of their populations. So how do those populations now look back on TRCs? The importance of archives has been spoken about, but I think there is the whole issue of grappling with this whole issue of complicity for many of an older generation who were alive at the time when there were perpetrations of hostility, and for younger generations, TRCs perhaps are just receding into the past. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Roger, and thanks for staying up late for us. I know it's quite late in Johannesburg where you are. And finally, Sylvia, if you could keep it under 7.
I will try. So thank you very much, everyone. I don't think I've ever worked on a project that humbled me so much, but also took me through so many emotional turmoils, because I ended up eventually actually shifting from what I had originally set out to research, which was that I wanted to look at the role of emotion in TRC, in the commission reports, and how that process played out in the various places. But at some point, it became too much for me, and I had to pull back, think about what else I could do. And then I ended up, again, going to something that was just as emotionally tasking, talking about and looking at the life of Winnie Mandela. I grew up admiring, of course, Winnie Mandela, as many of us did in Africa at the time. And I joked at some point that perhaps it might be because her husband had been in prison for a very long time. And we saw a woman who wasn't beholden necessarily to a domestic role, and someone who portrayed the strength that many of us had come to associate with our grandmothers, aunties, and whatnot. And so, as we note in the book, that, while there's been some attention paid to understanding truth commissions as transitional mechanisms, little attention has been given to understand them as civic participatory processes. So it is in this case that my intervention seeks to draw attention to the gendered nature of the state, and how that particularly gendered nature of states, post-colonial African context in particular, prescribe a type of civic participation for different categories of people. So even after the work of truth commissions are done and a nation is rebuilding, or ideally trying to rebuild, often it is not transforming those very structures that reproduce marginality and various other conditions for people who are on the margins. It does not often provide enough opportunity for others to participate beyond the prescribed area that is designated to them. In the case of women in post-colonial and settler colonial states, these contributions are only ever endorsed or recognized fully if they do not stray away from the normative and social reproductive realm. Otherwise, we see repercussions for particular individuals and even groups. So this attempt, and we see it often in various places, this attempt to simultaneously praise and diminish women's contributions to liberation and nation building struggles continues. And this was in the area in which my chapter was trying to make a certain intervention. So women's vulnerability to rights violations and abuses, including sexual violence, are linked to their marginalization, but in particular, for me, to this simultaneous positioning. So I make two interconnected arguments in the chapter, using Winnie Mandela, of course, that first, Winnie's particular case demonstrates the flaws of focusing on individuals in the TRC, because eventually, as you notice, from what some of the other contributors talked about, in the end, the reparations that the majority of Black South Africans were expecting has not yet yielded results. And this focus, in a way, also seem to have successfully diverted focus from holding the state accountable for its own untold horrors, and focuses that on individual perpetrators. And Winnie's own victimhood was erased, downplayed a lot by that process, and more importantly, her role in the successes of the liberation struggles, to me, to a very large extent, were also overshadowed by this process of the TRC. So looking at this, sort of simultaneous erasure, but reification of gender, especially where women are concerned, to justify sometimes the oppressive nature of a patriarchal state, as women continue to be sidelined in nation processes and nation building discourses, I think it's important for us to deconstruct these kinds of things. And this is, again, one of the things that I wanted to do in the chapter, I did in the chapter. So I wanted to, and so in the chapter, I then refer to this as, the way in which states see women and other marginalized groups as convenient, disposable, indispensables in the construction of nation states. In other words, our bodies, our labor, our work, in fact, our very presence and our identities are important to build in particular nation states. But when it comes to time for proper recognition and place, then we are just as easily disposed about or marginalized in the interest of the more elite groups. And so for me, in looking at the chapter, and given that I'm now under pressure to finish within 7 minutes, Winnie, in the case of South Africa, personifies the intersecting, the gendered, and the complex historical and systemic oppression of Black Africans in the colonial and post-colonial nation building discourses. And this is something that I think is also an area of future research for people who are looking at this, as has already been pointed out. I quote Winnie Mandela in an interview she gave after, not too long ago, actually, after the TRC process concluded. I quote, "If you were picking up the bodies of children on June the 16th, 1976, I cannot pretend that I suddenly woke up the following day, prayed to God, and I was this angel that I forgave, that I forgave. It was a battle. It is a process, and it's still a process," unquote. And I think that we do see this in the aftermath of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. David talked about that. The aftermath of DTRCs are the same. What is that process? So if we are thinking about, or other people are thinking about areas of future research, I think that this is an area to look at. What does that mean when people still carry these kinds of things? And even that aspect, that little aspect, so to speak, of forgiveness is something that becomes very difficult. I also, one of the questions that I asked in the chapter that I obviously did not answer, but hope that someone else picks it up, is, this use of Ubuntu, especially in the case of the South African TRC, and how that concept itself has been globalized thanks to Desmond Tutu. What Ubuntu means in the context of efforts at reconciling a nation, but through this skewed focus on individual harms, right? What does that mean really for us going forward in terms of nation building post-TRCs? And finally, another question that arises for me is how national TRCs address gender injustice to reset a nation post the TRC process. And I think that this is especially important in terms of the fact that when we are looking at these kinds of processes, and as others have pointed out, it's not just that these processes occurred within the time frame of any time that a TRC, or at the time frame that the TRC looked at, but that these things preceded and continue to happen after the TRC. And very finally, and that will be the end finally, is that anyone who is interested in actor network theory, I think that this is also a great area for research, because in part of the chapter, I looked at the kinds of infrastructure of the Truth, the Commission's setup. There's this great infrastructure, right? There are cameras, there are voices, there are all these people, there are all these things that you can look at beyond the human that end up assembling, troops or different versions of troops. So I think that looking at those other infrastructure or other items that we often don't look at beyond the humans are very important, or could be very interesting research areas for anyone particularly interested in actor network theory. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, and my apologies for constraining you. We want to be respectful of people's time. So we have a few minutes left. We were trying to keep this under an hour, 45 minutes, because we know everyone is busy and we have places to go. But I want to give an opportunity to members of the audience, those who are here, and those who've joined us. I still We still have some participants online during the 6th. If you have any questions, not just for the panelists, but for others who contributed to this volume. Like I said before, one of the gratifying things about this volume is that it brought together not just academics, but also practitioners. So we had lawyers who work with Lawyers Without Borders. We had activists working with the Rwandan Genocide Memorial, working on this volume. So it brings a distinctly academic and practitioner perspective to the workings of truth commissions. So I'd like to just throw the floor open now to the audience. If you have any questions.
I have one.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I think the book is awesome from what I've heard so far. I'm looking forward to getting my copy. But I'm curious to know, from you or any of the contributors, or you as well, who reviewed the book, are there any lessons you've learned about how not to conduct truth commissions? With the complexities that have been raised, the ambiguities, I'm really curious to know if there are any lessons you've learned about how not to do this.
I'll let David take that.
Don't bury them. Don't, when it's the end of the commission, make sure it can report. Make sure its report is made accessible. That the information that you've gathered is made available because it belongs to people who shared the information as much as anyone. And it belongs to the people as a whole in the country. And then don't say when you've handed in the report, that's it, we're all done. You gotta keep it going.
Yeah, but how do you handle issues like politics? So you mentioned how a politician in Timor-Leste tried to lay claim to, doing this thing. And I've read in the past how even Desmond Tutu had to struggle with politics, even with Mandela, interference with the commissions and all of that. Or people like both are refusing to show up. Even in Nigeria, when we had the supporter panel, one president refused to come, or he came there and was speaking to the panelists like, I don't have to be here and stuff like that. So how do you deal with those things, and then to make sure the Truth Commission really delivers on the objectives?
Yeah. I think all you can do is keep pushing. You can't leave it to the state. You can't leave it to the government. You have to, it goes back to civil society again afterwards, right? And people have to keep pushing for it. And I know that's really hard. And that doesn't answer the question really, but what else can I say?
Yeah, but it goes back to your point, David, that's a process. So if it's an ongoing process rather than a project, then I think you're right. We just keep pushing, And although we focus here on state-sponsored truth commissions, let's not forget that there are many lesser known grassroots truth commissions. I'm thinking here about the Greensboro Truth Commission, where community groups come together and say, well, we're tired of waiting for the states. We want to organize our own truth commissions. And in some cases, I've forgotten which country now, that became the foundation for a national truth commission. So there's all
South Korea,
yeah, South Korea. So it started off as a grassroots citizen-led truth initiative, and then the states came on board. But I think the larger point is that truth commissions are work in progress. And the idea is that we have to think about them as, and I like the point you made, David, about an open-ended truth commission. I forgot which country is that just said the doors will always be open. There's no, it's not time bound. This temporality that have become associated with truth commission has to be challenged, and there has to be recognition that it is a process. Okay, are there any other questions? Maybe we'll take a bunch of them and then answer them here.
Okay, so I've been thinking about how accessible it is, looking at how, looking at the investments put in this book, especially looking at Africa, in West Africa, where there's this book like WAEC. And why don't we push some of these books that those in the middle school can also read these things? Because I was kind of thinking that I heard this when I was in the university. But if I had known this maybe back in high school, at least I would have had a different concept about it. Then looking at these bodies, they could push this, that at least you can begin to also into that publicity. So I was kind of thinking about how possible are these measures.
Visibility and public enlightenment about the processes. Yes, any other, we'll take that, hopefully. Yes, Kojo, and then Mark.
Has there been any thought or literature work or research done about maybe, seeing that we now know some of the history around truth commissions, having it being embedded in constitutions, right? So that it's situated in a way that doesn't have to depend on groups and marginalized folks having to do the organizing to call these commissions. So has there been any work done around having a process for a truth commission embedded in a country's constitution?
Okay, and then finally, Mark.
Yeah, really interesting presentation, and you've chosen intentionally to put these concepts together, truth commissions and state building, and I think the case was really well made that they're implicitly tied, right? Because you're gonna do this thing and it's gonna have an implication when it's published to varying degrees of success. And I'm just interested for your perspectives and your research, when truth commissions are put together with that primary mandate to uncover the truth, are the members of that, the ones leading and conducting it, are they having like this act of state building, statecraft top of mind? I mean, the reconciliation part does prescribe things that should happen to bring about reconciliation, but you're almost taking the word further, like state building is, we are gonna put something out that potentially shapes the future of our country. It's a big leadership role. I'm curious what you think about the perspective of those in those leadership roles, about how they're building.
So I'm not gonna put anybody on the spot. So any of the contributors or panelists could address this. A question on the public dissemination of Truth Commission's reports, the possibilities of embedding Truth Commission processes and mandates into national constitutions rather than leaving them up to the whims of civil society activism. And a question on whether those involved in Truth Commission processes have state building top of mind, when they either initiate Truth Commissions or walk through the processes. So anyone wants to take a stab at this question? You heard anyone?
Morning, I'm here. I could just try and speak to his question. I mean,
you might want to introduce yourself.
Oh, my name is Paul Ugo. I'm a faculty member in the Department of English at the University of Waterloo, and I contributed a chapter in the book. And Rogers, I thought it was interesting that Rogers invoked my contribution in my name, and I thought it makes two of us, two imposters in the project. And I think this question is really important because it speaks to the central argument that I was trying to make in my contribution. The reason why you have truth commissions in the first place is that the Constitution has failed, right? So if you embed, the Constitution is there, the provisions are there, right? There isn't any provision in the Constitution for anybody to unleash violence and injustice on anyone. The reason why we have truth commissions is precisely because the instruments or the institutions responsible for implementing provisions of the Constitution failed to do that, right? But what this means then is that we keep making reference, and David has said this, and Bonnie has referenced it, severally, that transitional justice is a process. But my argument is that it's not a legal process, right? It's not necessarily a legal process. It is in many ways a cultural endeavor. It is not a legal process because you cannot legislate love. You cannot legislate cultural tolerance. You cannot legislate empathy, right? The reason why there is an explosion of atrocious violence in any country is precisely because there is a collapse of a moral vision about that country. That is not a constitutional issue, it is a cultural issue. So when we keep saying that truth commissions somehow are embedded in this sort of long, infinite process, basically we're saying that it's not purely about the law, that is purely always about the ways in which we mobilize all kinds of narratives to justify the existence of an individual or group or, particular groups of people. So my argument would be that the problem is not the Constitution. The problem is a failure of the culture. So what we need to do is not to embed the mandate or the need or the imperative for transitional justice in the Constitution. It is to emphasize the role of culture and engineering in nation building, right? And that comes to storytelling. The argument I make in my chapter, several of them, if you look at truth commissions, they depend entirely on storytelling. Victims have to tell a story of what happened to them. Perpetrators have to tell you a story of what they did, right? Then you have journalists, you have scholars, you have all people who then write their own narratives and account of what happened. And I was very privileged to read a doctoral thesis of a brilliant student at Western, who just argued in his work recently that even the justice system itself depends on storytelling. And truth commissions themselves what they are trying to do is to cobble together a story about what happened in the past, right? So in other words, there is the centrality of narrativity in truth commissions. And it comes back to the point that David made. If it is storytelling that is central to the whole endeavor, and even the objective of truth commission, because even Desmond Tutu said it, Nelson Mandela told his story, everybody, the ANC politicians told their stories. We're not interested in those stories. We're interested in the stories of ordinary people, common people in the street, right? So the objective of truth commissions itself, storytelling. The instrument is storytelling, the objective is storytelling, and we depend on archives for storytelling is another version of storytelling. What that tells us is that this is not a legal endeavor, that it is primarily a cultural enterprise. So the fix is not to embed transitional justice in a constitution, it is to reinvent the culture.
That's
I'm sorry,
spoken like a true cultural studies scholar.
Yeah.
It's not a legal You can tell, you don't need to tell us you're a cultural studies scholar. Yeah. Only he's laughing, he's a legal scholar. Trying to see what he has to say.
I'm happy to have that conversation with you. Maybe we can have it over a glass of wine.
Yes. Yeah, that's very interesting. But it's a tension that manifests in the workings of Truth Commission. You find the definitions that they are legal, they're non-legal, non-judicial. Then you find some definitions that they're quasi-legal, they're quasi-judicial. They have subpoena powers, but they're not quite regular courts. So there is a dance there that's happening both at an intellectual level in conceptualizing truth commissions, but also in terms of how they actually work. And definitely that's a cultural dimension to it, which is so well articulated. But I know a lot of legal scholars who will disagree that there's no legal foundations to it. I think there's a balance in between that. But like I said, that's a conversation that you and Obi can continue over drinks.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, so do we have any other questions? Yes,
I
please.
just wanted to contribute a little to the question around how, we make this a tool of socialization. And I think that this is one of the things that Abina talks about, David talked about this, that, the document doesn't just become something that sits on the decks of policymakers, but it becomes something that the ordinary citizen, children, people are socialized about, not just the document, but about the stories, the truths that emerge from that process. And it's very much, like a part of our history or parts of history, but how you get that implemented then becomes a problem. And Professor Bauer talked about this at the beginning. Anyone who is familiar with the point 94 action calls in Canada's own will let you know. Sometimes it then depends on educators, on people who are signing these kinds of things in their class. But I think primarily it's about how we socialize the next generation about these kinds of things, because the more knowledge they have about them, the more they are able to change things. Of course, there are other people who also worry about that, because then they are like, if they know too much, what could happen with people who would still who have interest in revenge and whatnot. And there is that, possibility as well, on how you manage those kinds of things. Now, the other question around whether or not people have, state building at the back of their minds when they are doing this, I think that is very much woven into a lot of the preambles and the objectives of these two commissions. When they set them up, there's the idea that nations are looking for returning. There's this recurring notion of return to a certain harmonious past, whatever and whenever that past may be. No one talks about that, but there's always this understanding that the things that have happened that have necessitated the commissioning of a truth commission are not that which reflect the best values of that nation, right? So there is some of that in that conversation, and there's also the idea that if we can say that these are our values, or that this is where we went wrong, then we can correct ourselves as a nation or as a society. So there is that imagined in there, because at the end of the day, there is also the understanding that if you don't correct those things, these kinds of fragmentation that are occurring within the nations would make it virtually impossible for you to hold it together going forward, which is where I think sometimes it gets to that point when people realize, okay, we do need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but if it doesn't come to that critical stage, then people are still dancing around whether, is this important? Should we devote resources to it? But when the tensions rise to the point where people think this then becomes a way to placate, people, then that becomes, so I would say and argue that that is very much probably central to the whole point of setting up these two commissions.
Thank you so much. I'd like to continue the conversation, but we must draw it to a close at this time. I have a lot of thank yous, and I just crave the indulgence for a few minutes more while I run through them. The whole idea of this book, just came from some conversations I had with a couple of colleagues at the early stages of the formation of the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. And I want to thank Juanita De Barros, the director of the center. I want to thank my colleagues in the history department who've been very generous with their time and providing the space for the center. The Faculty of Humanities at McMaster University, and McMaster University that has supported not just the center, but these important conversations, global conversations I might add, about transitional justice and the work of truth commissions. I want to thank keynote speaker, David Webster, for coming all the way from Bishop's University on a beautiful day like this, and giving such an insightful commentary on the volume. Thank you so much, David. To those who make things happen, Melike and the colleagues, I mean, I really think Melike did it. Melike Yilmaz, who just wears so many hats, but is really, frankly, the engine behind so much of the coordination that makes this happen. And the excellent team that works with her, Nandi, Nadeem, Jennifer Wallens, and all the graduate students, who am I missing?
Oyinade.
Oyinade, yes, Oyinade, and all the wonderful graduate students. I like to say that these projects, the Confronting Atrocity Project, that forms the basis of so much of the data, really it's driven by graduate students, students in the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice, and students affiliated with the Confronting Atrocity Project, who work to excavate the data that makes all of these possible. So I thank you so much. Participedia, I don't know if Paul's still here. So the Participedia Project, and Paul and Jesse and the Participedia is not primarily concerned with truth commissions, but they help us collate some of the data with the Truth Commission collections on Participedia. So I like to thank my Participedia team for also contributing to this project. To Emily and McGill Queen's University Press, thank you for believing in this project. Thank you for the investments in this project. When we wrote the proposal for this book and for the Confronting Atrocity series, one of the points I made was trying to let McGill Queens know why it is important that this series is housed with a prominent Canadian press. Canada is the first Western democracy to have established a Truth Commission. And it has become a reference point. Canada is actually a reference point for truth commissions emerging in much of the global north. You know, if you read the reports and processes of the Norwegian Truth Commission, much of the reference is to Canada, just because the circumstances are similar. So there's an emerging field of Truth Commission in stable democracies that centers Canada as part of that conversation. Of course, drawing from the origins of Truth Commissions in the global south, that increasingly leveraging the experience of Canada. So it was important for us to have a Canadian publisher for this, you know, not a European and American publisher, but a Canadian publisher. So I thank McGill Queen's Press for stepping up and for supporting our proposal for a Confronting Atrocity series that continues the conversations globally about Truth Commission. Thanks to the Social Science and Humanities Research Council. I hope they see these somehow. For the grants that made this possible, conferences around the world to get this conversation going, a partnership grant for Participedia and an insight grant for the Confronting Atrocity Project, what makes all of these kinds of conversations possible globally. I want to thank someone who isn't here. This is a very unique cover, and it's an original cover, and it was painted by an old classmate of mine. His name is Benedict Imedia, and I told him I was writing this book, and I didn't want a generic cover, and I wanted something that will be as iconic a cover as the message of the book, you know, hopefully. And he produced this, an original oil painting, iconic painting of Desmond Tutu lifting the hands of Mandela when he presented the Truth Commission reports to Mandela. It's an oil painting that adorns the walls of my office and one that I'm very proud of. So Benedict, if you're still online or if you're there, thank you so much for the labor of love that is the painting for this book. And then finally, there's a dedication to, the dedication to this book is something I want to read because I think it's very important. We chose collectively to dedicate this book to survivors. And the dedication for this book is to all survivors who, at the risk of re-traumatization, bear witness to atrocities. When you do Truth Commission studies, you're going back to people who have been traumatized, and you're asking them to tell their stories again. And those of us who work in this field know that there's always the danger of re-traumatization. And as academic, we get the benefit of having a nice book published and getting brownie points for promotion and tenure. But sometimes there's always the concern that this is at the expense of people who suffered unspeakable trauma, that we're asking to tell their stories over and over and over again. So I thank all those who grant us interviews, who allow us to talk to them about their pain. This book is dedicated to them, and I hope that it is a fitting tribute to their commitment to confronting atrocities and making sure it never happens again. Thank you very much.